When you think about God, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's probably this image of a being who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and absolutely perfect. A being who never, ever changes. But what if that whole picture isn't just incomplete? What if it actually gets in the way of understanding our own lives? Well, today, we're diving into a really radical alternative called process theology. So this is the big question, right? This is what process theology throws at us. It really challenges centuries of tradition by suggesting that, hey, maybe God isn't some distant, static king on a throne. Maybe God is a fellow traveler in the universe, a being who is right there with us in our struggles, our joys, and our growth. It's a huge shift in thinking, so let's unpack how we even get there. Okay, so before we can really get the solution, we've got to understand the problem. And according to process thinkers, the problem is baked right into that idea of perfection that's dominated Western thought for so long. This traditional viewpoint is what folks call classical theism, and the core idea is that God exists completely outside of time, totally independent and absolutely unaffected by anything that happens here in our world. God is pure, absolute, unchanging perfection. But this idea, as we're about to see, creates a massive disconnect. So on one side, you have this classical God who is described as impassive, which means without passion, without emotion, unchanging, unaffected. But then you look at our lives, and we're the complete opposite, aren't we? We are all about emotion, growth, suffering, and our relationships with others. This isn't just a tiny difference, it's a huge clash in how we see reality. And believe me, this wasn't some minor detail they just glossed over. This quote here is from Thomas Aquinas, one of the heaviest hitters in the history of theology, and he spells it out clear as day. If God has no passions, and love is a passion, then logically, love, at least love as we feel and experience it, cannot be in God. He basically argued God's love was more like a creative goodwill, not a feeling, responsive emotion. And that leads to a really serious emotional problem, doesn't it? I mean, how are we supposed to relate to a God who can't feel our pain? Traditional theology kind of said, well, God loves you by doing good for you, sort of like a rich father who provides for his kids, but doesn't really feel anything for them. For a lot of people, that's a really unsatisfying answer. And that's not even the only problem. The other side of this coin was the whole idea of God's power. Classical theism didn't just see God as perfect, but as the absolute controlling power. This idea, this doctrine of divine omnipotence, basically meant that God caused and controlled every single tiny detail of everything that happens, everywhere, all the time. And you can probably see where this is going. This brings us to a huge logical problem. If a good and loving God is meticulously pulling every string, then that God is also directly responsible for every war, every disease, every single act of cruelty. And that creates this enormous problem of evil that theologians have been wrestling with for centuries. So we have two massive problems. One is emotional, the other is logical. Process theology looks at this whole mess and proposes something really radical. It doesn't just try to patch the old model, it rebuilds it from the ground up, starting with the very nature of God. See, instead of trying to explain away this conflict between an unchanging God and our changing world, process thinkers decided to lean into it, to embrace that tension. They suggested that, well, maybe God isn't simple. Maybe God is complex, just like the reality we all experience every day. And this is the core idea, sometimes called dipolar theism. It's the idea that God has two aspects, or poles, that exist at the same time. God isn't just one or the other, God is both. One pole is abstract and eternal, while the other is concrete and completely engaged with time and change. Let's break that down a bit. First, you've got the primordial nature. This is the eternal, unchanging part. You can think of it as this grand, abstract source of all the potential in the universe. Every idea, every value, every single possibility that could ever exist. But then you have the consequent nature. And this is the part that is concrete, that's in time, and that is constantly changing because it's so deeply connected to our world. And this right here is the absolute game changer for that emotional problem we talked about. In this view, God's knowledge isn't just a list of facts. God's consequent nature is fully responsive. It takes in the entire experience of the world. And that means God genuinely feels our joy. And so importantly, God suffers right along with our sufferings. God is the fellow sufferer who understands. So Okay, that addresses the emotional problem of a distant, unfeeling God. But what about that logical problem of evil and a God who's supposed to be controlling everything? Well, process theology answers this by completely rethinking what divine power even means. The big shift here is from what's called coercive power to persuasive power. The old model, right, it saw God as a puppet master, pulling every string, causing everything to happen. Process theology says, nope, that's not it at all. Instead, it suggests that God's power is more like a loving guide. God doesn't force or compel or cause events, God persuades. So, how does this persuasion work? Well, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead had this incredible idea. He proposed that for every single moment, for every single being, from a tiny atom to you and me, God provides what he called an initial aim. This is the best, most beautiful, most creative possibility for that being in that exact situation. But, and this is the most important part, every being has the freedom to respond to that aim. We can accept it, we can ignore it, or we can choose a lesser path. The future isn't dictated, it's co-created by all of us in God. The implications of this are just massive. If God's power is persuasive, not coercive, then God does not control the world. It means our freedom is absolutely real, and it totally solves that logical problem of evil. Evil and suffering exist because creatures, with their real freedom, can and do reject God's aims for beauty and harmony. Evil is a tragic, terrible reality, but it's not something willed by a loving God. So, if God is a fellow sufferer who persuades us rather than controls us, what does that mean for our lives? What's the whole point of everything? And this leads us to the final, and maybe the most exciting part of this whole way of thinking. Traditional thinking often portrayed God as a kind of cosmic moralist who was mainly concerned with rules and making sure everyone behaved, often at the expense of actual enjoyment. Process theology just flips this completely on its head. It sees God's main goal as promoting enjoyment and intensity of experience for all creatures. Morality isn't the end goal, it's the really important tool we use to create a world with the richest, deepest, and most widely shared experiences possible. Just think about that for a second. The purpose of the universe isn't some big moral test, it's an aesthetic project. God is constantly luring creation forward, nudging it toward greater complexity, deeper feeling, and more tragic beauty. Life becomes an adventure in creating and experiencing value. And that brings us to this final really powerful idea. This isn't just our adventure, it's God's adventure too. Because God's consequent nature is shaped by everything that happens in the universe, God is also on a journey. God takes risks. That persuasive call to novelty and beauty, it doesn't have a guaranteed outcome. God shares in both the tragedy and the incredible beauty that we all create. And so we end right back where we started, with a question. The traditional view is all about aiming for a final, perfect, unchanging heaven. But process theology leaves us with a completely different vision. It suggests that maybe the real value is in the journey itself, in the struggle, the growth, the creation of beauty out of chaos, and invites us to see ourselves not as subjects of some distant king, but as creative partners in a divine adventure of becoming.